So why did you get into string theory? What was it that made you go into this direction?
I was 3. We had moved to St. John's, Newfoundland, and we lived there for 3 years. While we were there, my mother took her then 3 children to see a movie. The movie was called Spaceways. It took me years to find this. I saw this movie when I was 4. I think it's the first movie I ever saw in life. I still carry pictures in my head, and I'm 74 now, of this movie. And about 15 or 20 years ago, I decided to use those pictures together with the web to find out what the movie was.
Hmm.
After about 10 years of not constant effort, but episodic effort, I finally found the movie. It's this. And these are some playbills from the movie. And these are some scenes from the movie. It is these 2 scenes that I have carried in my head for 70 years and that allowed me to find the movie. That evening, I am told, because I don't remember this, I'm told that evening when Dad came home from work, I told him I wanted to grow up and become a scientist. Now, why I figured that out at age 4, I'm not sure. I tell people it's probably because what does a 4-year-old boy want in life? How about fun and adventure? And somehow this movie had given me a sense that fun and adventure is attached to science. And so I told him I wanted to be a scientist. At least that's what he and my mother had told me many times about me and science. Oh, by the way, I watched it. It's terrible. After I found it, I watched it. I said, "Oh my God, this is a terrible movie." This is me in 2nd grade, which is
Hmm.
relevant to our story next because I knew arithmetic before I started school. And that's not unusual in my family because my grandfather could neither read nor write, but he could do arithmetic. So we kind of like math in my family, and it goes back now several generations. And that's part of the answer to your question about why supersymmetry. My dad never finished high school, but he earned a GED degree, and I remember watching him. And he seemed especially to have fun with geometry and algebra and trigonometry. So like I said, we like math, but when I was in 2nd grade, I was having trouble learning to read and write. So a teacher suggested, in a parent-teacher conference, suggested that my parents should bring home some books about things that I like. So this is one book that my father brought home. And this particular book was uh, was really totally instrumental in my going from not being able to read to being able to read. He also remembered that his 4-year-old son spoke about science and becoming an astronaut, so he brought home these books. And so I quickly became a pretty proficient reader because these were the things that I loved. And even though I was having trouble, I wanted to understand the stories in these things. So I learned. My mom died in 62 from breast cancer. My dad remarried a year later. Uh, my new stepmom was a teacher in Orlando, Florida. And even though I was born in Tampa, this is the first time I'm back in Florida. And so you've seen some of this at the Orlando Library. So this was and when we got to Orlando, we actually first went to school in Winter Park at Hannibal Elementary, which no longer exists, but it's at the location of where Hannibal Square is in Winter
Yeah.
Park. And this was my teacher, sorry, our principal, uh, Miss Reed. And then I got to Jones High in 7th grade. So I'm going to race past this because you can find probably most of this at the library.
Yep.
Here's the chess club, by the way. So you ask about it. This is actually just half of the chess club. This is the half that went out and competed at the other schools. Here I am. This is my youngest brother. This guy here is named Philip Dunn. He's the person who first challenged me on the chessboard. He knew how to play chess. I didn't. And I was very competitive in these sorts of things. So
Mm.
it crystallized a intense rivalry, which ultimately became a friendship, and that's the basis for creating the chess club. That, like I said, we were never defeated in any of the matches with our high schools in Orlando. I was reading comic books, but when I was 14, I found out that this place existed, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and I saw a television story about it. And what I got from the story was that at MIT, they only made you study math and science. Since I called that the good stuff, I immediately told my father that's where I wanted to go to college. Here's some of that stuff with the Orlando Sentinel I was telling you about.
Hmm.
This is November 23rd, 1969. And they were looking towards what's going to happen in the 70s. And for whatever reason, oh, yeah, so I had won a scholarship um, from General Dynamics Corporation, and that was in the newspaper. The Sentinel had a piece about that. And so when they were doing this story, some journalists remembered there was this kid that was all going off to MIT. And so they actually interviewed me. You can said, let's see, Jim Gates sees the 70s as the computer age, not the space age. Numbers instead of names, numbers instead of names, and credit cards instead of money. He predicted. So this is a kid in 1969 saying what the 70s are going to be like. Uh, and I was the first person, I was, valedictorian. And I said I wanted to pioneer problem-solving computers. And I actually do that this right now, which is amazing to me that at age 18 and 19, I had such a clear sense of what I wanted to do. Um, so anyhow, my valedictorian picture, then off to MIT and a lot of pain. Uh,
Why pain?
because it was the hardest. High school was never a challenge for me at any level. And so when I was admitted to MIT, I understood. Well, let's go back to chess because our chess team taught me an incredibly valuable lesson about our society. And this probably is at the Orlando Library discussion. But when we formed our chess team, which we call Le Noir Chevalier
Yeah.
et Ajax, yes. When we formed that chess team and challenged the other high schools, they would never come to Jones High to play the matches. So we always had to go to their locations. And I can remember the first time this happened, being shocked at the disparity in what was being invested in my school, Jones High, versus these other schools. And so I got a sense that since they weren't treating all kids fairly, that black kids were being having society place bets against them. And therefore I understood that even though I had fantastic teachers at Jones High, um, the cards were stacked against me. That my teachers did the best they could, and I had a fantastic physics teacher, which is really what was a saving grace, Mr. Coney, whose picture
Mhm.
is there. He was utterly off scale. He might have been, in my opinion, he was probably the best physics teacher in Orlando, but because he was an African American, he could only teach at Jones High as opposed to being somewhere else or in another industry making a lot of money. But he was utterly fantastic. During my 11th grade of high school, I learned about Einstein's special relativity from this man and understood it. I also learned about quantum mechanics from this man and understood things like quantum jumps and electrons and orbits and stuff like that, which is at the basis. So, like I said, a fantastic physics teacher, but in other ways, there were deficits in my education. So when I got to MIT, I had to confront those deficits, and it was very painful. Um, the biggest shock was sort of my emotional state because when I would sit down for an exam, for the first 20 minutes, I couldn't write anything. I was just emotionally unable to engage the exam. And then maybe 20 minutes after the exams begun, I started to write. But anyhow, by the end of an hour, everyone else has had an hour-long exam. I've had a 40-minute exam. That's not a prescription for showing good understanding. I built up tremendous frustration and there were lots of times of crying. That's why. Over here, you see a bowling ball. That's what saved me, because I recognized that the negative emotions I was building up would have destroyed me. And so I had to find a way to release them and have something I had in a way that I was having good evidence of progress and just to lift my spirits. So I learned to bowl. And in fact, I got to the level of professional bowler basically by the time I got my PhD because of how much it meant to support my emotional well-being. When I got to MIT, these are some of the people I met. Dr. Shirley Jackson, who is amazing. She's a physicist, first of all. At least she was getting her PhD, about 2 years away from her PhD when I met her. She taught me physics in the summer of 1969 when I left Jones High. It was a transition program. She was the physics teacher. Shirley went on to become the head of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Agency, the president of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. She was I believe she was the chair of the New York Stock Exchange for a while. I mean, she's an utterly fantastic person. And she was my first physics teacher at MIT. Vera Kislikowski was, when I started in the fall, was my recitation instructor. And she was so kind and encouraging and saw that I wanted to do, but, saw that there were sort of I call them bad apps in my head that were running. And then Dr. McVicker sort of took me in her laboratory, taught me a bunch of laboratory skills. Kurt Carl Ingart. At MIT in those days, you had to write a undergraduate thesis in physics to get a degree. He was my undergraduate thesis advisor from Iceland, if I remember correctly. He was a great mentor. And then finally, Professor James Young, an African-American, the only African-American teacher I had at MIT. He's the first African-American physics faculty member that MIT had ever hired. And he himself had an MIT PhD from, I think, 48 or 50 or something like that. Summer of 75, this is me teaching calculus in the summer of 75 in that same transition program where I met Shirley Jackson. By this time, I was committed to the idea of becoming a college professor because I love teaching and have done so ever since. My undergraduate thesis is on this. This is me at the blackboard, my back turned. This is a friend named Mel Brown. This room was a room this is a picture taken when I was a graduate student. And this room was basically abandoned in the physics department. It wasn't being used. And so a group of us Black students went to the department and asked if we could use it as a meeting place. And so we gave it a name. We called it the Colored Center for Theoretical and Experimental Physics. And that name itself is a joke. CC Tech, that's what we called it. In grad school, I met this guy. Very famous. I see you shaking here. That's Ron McNair, who died on this space shuttle. But I met him first in the summer of 69 when I came to that transition program. And then in 1973, he and I both started graduate school at MIT. We're very good friends. And in fact, he was pivotal in my graduate career at MIT to go on and successfully complete my PhD. And I played the same role for him to complete his PhD. Ron convinced me to do this. As I was leaving Harvard, he called and said, you ought to apply to NASA to become an astronaut. So I did. This is from a website in Germany where they keep records of such things. And so you can see what it says at the top. This is me when I actually got my PhD. Dad came up to the graduation. I missed my undergraduate graduations because neither parent came up because I didn't really care about graduation, but I did care about supporting my parents. Then it was off to Harvard. This is the first physics conference I went to at Stony Brook. I met this guy in 1980, and
Wow.
then met Stephen many, many times at various places around the world after that. And this is commencement of 1982. Me and a friend of mine named James Hubbard. We were both faculty members at MIT. We both left in 1984 because neither of us felt MIT had a real commitment to diversity. And I know in my case, I felt it would be a charade for me to stay, so I left. Okay, so let me go back to this picture, these two pictures, because these are the answer to your question. I'm sorry if I've taken you through the hills and dales, but I want to get all this stuff out. When I was a graduate student trying to write my PhD thesis, I first began under Professor Young's tutelage, whose picture I showed you.
Mhm.
And he had me working on a class of problems that was quite popular at the time. And I concluded that um, if I was going to build a successful career, I had to strike out in a direction of my own. So I looked at everything that was going on in my part of physics, and I found this one piece of mathematics that was unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was the idea of supersymmetry that we had talked about earlier for string theory.
Mhm.
Uh, Another Nobel laureate by the name of Abdus Salam, whose picture is also here later, had created a new kind of geometry around this idea. And it was this geometry that caught my attention. And since it was new, it meant that I could know as much about this as anyone else studying it. And
Mhm.
that to me felt like a fair competition. And that's what drew me into string theory. These are some of my early mentors. Mark Grisseru was a professor at Brandeis University. Bruno Zumino is one of the people who invented the mathematics for supersymmetry. And Peter van Nieuwenhuizen was the inventor of something called supergravity. So these are folks who supported me early in my career. And here's me at Caltech. I tell people I had the perfect circle afro in those days. Earlier, I mentioned this guy.
Yes.
This is John Schwartz. He's this Schwartz I mentioned in trying to say string theory. And ultimately, he met me when I was still in graduate school, or maybe it was first year, maybe while I was a postdoc. But he met me, and he got the idea. No, I'm sorry. It was when I was a postdoc. He met me, and he got the idea that I really was on the ball with respect to the mathematics that was at the foundation of string theory.
Mhm.
Um, this guy here is Murray Gourmand, who actually for years supported John as a fact in an appointment at Caltech. This is Richard Feynman.
Yes.
So I was a postdoc in the group headed by Gourmand and Feynman. And here's another picture of me, the same period. And then this is Abdus Salam, the guy who created this mathematics of superspace, which attracted me to this subject. Okay, so that's my long-winded answer to your question.
But there's something about math that clearly makes you giddy. It makes you
That's true.
very, very, what is it?
Well, I showed you, I'm glad I did take you to the long-winded story. I showed you some comic books
Yes.
that I was an avid reader of comic books and science fiction when I was in high school. And one of the things I noticed while I was still reading comic books was most of my friends had stopped doing that in high school, but I hadn't. And I also noticed that I was still using my imagination and they weren't. And I knew that somehow I knew that imagination is very, very important if you're going to try to be a creative person in life. And so for me, reading science fiction and reading comic books was supporting my imagination. So when I was in 11th grade taking Mr. Coney's physics class, and I introduce you to him also. I am now so happy I take you through the entire story. He, within the first week or so in the class, he did something that totally shocked me. He took a board and he tilted it, and then it had a ruler along the front of it, and then he let a ball roll down the board, and you can find pictures of this at YouTube, for example. And if you let the ball roll down and time it, what you find is after 1 second, it has moved 1 unit. After 2 seconds, it has moved 4 units. And after 3 seconds, it has moved 9 units down the board. In other words, it's a piece of math. What's going on is that you square the amount of time to figure how far it has moved. This was totally stunning to me because up until then, I had always thought of math just like science fiction. I thought of it as a game that our teachers taught us to play in school, and I didn't see the connection to reality at all. And since, like you said, it's kind of multi-generational in our family that we I always loved to play with the math, but to learn that it had this kind of power, I tell people it's a little bit like, it's a little bit like Harry Potter and Hogwarts, because, at Hogwarts, you learn to say these Latin words, and then something happens around you.
Hmm.
In physics, you learn the mathematics and you learn about the things happening around you, but you also learn about how to make things happen that have never happened before. And so that's why I make the comparison between physics and magic, because it's about, we say these strange words, we write these strange symbols, but that's kind of goes on with Harry Potter and his friends.
Hmm.
But in our world, it's real. And so that's part of what delights me about mathematics is that an element of our imagination is capable of creating things in the world around us that no one's ever seen before.
But I think it's really interesting talking about imagination, and you were still using your imagination. How
Yes.
important is imagination to science and math?
So let me, have you ever heard of Ramanujan?
No.
You probably have, but I'll remind you.
Okay.
There was a couple of movies came out about him within the last decade. Let me see if I can find something. Okay, so I found something. I found this picture at least, so let's do that. Share.
Yes, I've seen his picture.
I told you you had.
What's awful is it's totally because I used to watch Ancient Aliens.
Well, he's not an ancient alien. He's
Yeah.
real people. So Ramanujan was this incredible mathematician. And the reason I like to point to him is to get people to focus on something which you probably yourself experienced, but just not focus upon it. This person is the sharpest example in history that mathematics comes from the imagination. Because he literally dreamed up formulas, have these dreams, wake up in the morning, write, I'm sorry, have the dreams, write them while he's having them, go back to sleep, and then wake up in the morning and find out they were valid mathematical equations. He worked with an English mathematician named Hardy, who kind of discovered him. And in fact, he was working in a patent office when he sent a letter to Hardy, just like Einstein was working.
Fine.
So it's amazing these geniuses end up in patent offices, right? But the point is, he sharply demonstrates this. He's the sharpest demonstration I know. That's why I like to bring him up. And now I'm going to ask you a question. How many times have you said, well, when confronted with a problem, said, I'm going to go to sleep on it. And then when you wake up, there's a solution in your head.
Yeah.
That's a pretty common experience. So how did that actually happen? The answer, that as far as I understand the process, is that our subconscious, even when we sleep, our subconscious is capable of doing rational things. And in the case of this guy, it was doing mathematics. And I don't claim that I'm anywhere near as accomplished as this, but I have experienced that. I was a freshman at MIT the first time I recognized that my imagination actually has the capacity to do mathematics. It's how I learned half of calculus. And that's why I emphasize imagination from my own personal experience, from the general experience that people have saying, I'm going to sleep on this. Suddenly an answer appears, but people don't ask, what happened? How'd you get that answer? It's because you're not awake. So something is working in your mind. It's your subconscious.
So you had said something interesting because I mean, for one thing, when you were talking, like when I watched the Orlando Memory uh, interview, you had said that you felt like the people when you got to Jones High School that you were with on Mount Olympus. But you
Yeah.
also just said that you noticed your students weren't using your fellow students weren't using their imagination.
Yes.
What is happening there? What, do we just as we get older not prioritize that, or is there something else going on? Because you also talked, I, I'm wondering if it has something to do with the fact that you saw also that Black students were not being invested in as well as other students. And I'm wondering if there's some kind of correlation there.
Well, I thought so at the time, but let me just say that our society is not investing in all students as much as it did in the certainly in the 50s, and even when I was a student. During the 1980s, after I became a faculty member here at the University of Maryland, one day I gave a lecture, and afterwards, a group of students came up to the lectern because they had questions. It was the normal process. And as they were going through their questions, it dawned on me that from the nature of their questions, they had received a lower quality of education than I had, finishing in 1969 from an all-black high school in Orlando, Florida. And the thing that was stunning to me is none of these students were African Americans. And so there's a social dynamic at work in our country that has actually been at work probably since the 50s, because I've talked to older people older than me, and they talk about their high school experiences. For example, logic used to be taught in schools in California in the late 50s and early 60s. Nothing like that occurs in schools now. Actual logic, which is a distinct discipline of the mind. And so the dynamic that's at work in our society, undermining all learning, in my opinion, has been at work for at least 70 years now. And I was introduced to it, the differential investment and understanding the implications that they had for people's education in the middle to late 60s. But it's a general process at work, as far as I can tell. But yes, that's how I became aware of it.
Is there any idea what caused that shift? I mean, there is a lack of not a lack of creativity, but a lack of curiosity or understanding of how to harness what they have.
Yes, I agree with you. That's my assessment. And in fact, I worry about it even more post-COVID, because COVID seems to have done something to students that has damaged learning. It's quite remarkable. When when I was a student, I certainly had a sense, and I was able to maintain this all through high school, that when you don't know how to do something, that doesn't stop you from trying.
Mhm.
And the thing that I keep seeming, at least my perception of it is, there's a lot more when students get to the point where they don't know how to do something, they don't try. Now, they have a substitute for that. I'm going to go online and find the answer, right? But they don't have a personal investment in trying to create this new piece of information. And this is something that is, to me, extraordinarily dangerous for our society, because if this is going on as I perceive it to be, science itself is actually going to be put at risk. The country ultimately will be put at risk because the innovation that everyone likes to talk about, Elon Musk and Ramaswamy, they always talk about innovation. That innovation is actually harnessing of the imagination. And if we as a society are not hospitable to the idea of supporting our young people maintaining that capacity into adulthood, then that innovation is going to be lost.
What can we do to try and change the trajectory of what is to come? I mean, I look at AI in particular, that I know I need to get better at harnessing it so that I can move forward. But on the other hand, it scares the crap out of me.
Sure. I don't know. I actually, at the bottom of my emails, one link is to a interview I did for the American Mathematical Society last January. It's a two-person sort of moderated interview, and it's on AI and the future of mathematics, because this is something I have been thinking about since around 2012. In 2012, while I was advising on Obama's Science and Technology Advisory Council, another person on that council was Eric Schmidt. And Eric Schmidt at the time was the CEO of Google.
Okay.
And one day, Eric turned to me and said, in 5 years, we're going to have computers that do what you do. And I don't remember how I answered him, but I do remember what I thought. Not unless they can dream. Because this goes back to this element of the imagination, which I claim drives human creativity. And so, unless you have a technology that is able to make these leaps, because that's effectively what happens, is that in our subconscious, when we're being creative, we go from a state of not knowing, looking at the library of knowledge that sits in each of our heads, even though we don't know it's there, by the way. Actually, the subconscious is incredible, and we can come back and talk about it in a moment. But whatever it is, it looks at the problem, it looks at this library of stuff that we have, and then it leaps and says, these two things connect, and here's a solution. Now, if you can, I mean, if the technology gets to that level, he's right, but it's not there. It's certainly not there yet.
Mhm.
I actually have been using AI in a very lowbrow way. Uh, when I write things, instead of searching for a particular item, Google actually has AI. You can type questions in, and
Mhm.
the AI will provide you with an answer. Now, what I find generally is that it gets confused. And so, but sometimes it's right. I mean, so, I can see progress here, but it's amazing. It's like a little bit like talking to a preschooler in
Yeah.
some ways. But the fact that it's got this stage is a warning. And maybe Eric is right, but it's not there yet. And until we can until the technology is capable of reproducing our process of using imagination to figure out new solutions, then he's going to not be right. Now the
So going back to this idea of the interconnectedness of things, because obviously imagination is connected to science, and we're kind of peeling that away. And we're,
well, most people are. The scientists themselves are not. Most
but
of the people who do science at its cutting edge appear, in my mind, to have a very deep understanding of the connection of the ability to imagine. Well, let me say it this way. Um, there's a reason why in science you can actually give an argument what imagination does. So knowledge is like a ball of finite size, right? So let's say it's this big. And if you come back and say 10 years, it's going to be bigger.
Mhm.
So what is the actual dynamic that's driving this growth? Well, right at the boundary where you know stuff and you do an experiment or something or observation and you get a result and it's not in what you know, then you have to figure out a new answer. Now, typically, if you have lots of people doing this, you're going to get a lot of wrong answers. However, if enough people do it for long enough, you're going to get the right answer. And that's actually how the ball of knowledge grows. So knowledge actually drives scientific progress. And so therefore, at some level, scientists understand this very well.
But has science in some ways been decoupled from technology and technological advances?
Yes and no. I don't know how long, I don't, do you concentrate on, is science your beat, so to speak?
Politics is my beat. Science is what I do for fun.
Okay, so um, about 20 years ago, when the Human Genome Project was
Sure.
a hot item, there was a pause in that research because the community understood that this kind of advance had both up and down sides, and it's something that, with intentionality, the community needs to think about. So that, to me, is a great example where a group of scientists and technologists, um, in a meaningfully intentional way, ask some questions about what are the downsides. Now, of course, the creation of the atomic bomb is exactly the opposite. The questions are only asked after when the bomb was basically almost dropped. It's like,
Mhm.
oh, gee, are there some downsides to this thing, right? So it can go both ways, the decoupling. I think the decoupling that we see now is largely a function of the economic uh, milieu in which we exist. Our country is in the middle of a second Gilded Age where a very small group of people have become fantastically wealthy. Doesn't The leadership of our society doesn't understand the dangers, and therefore, at least since the 80s, there's been this belief that this sort of capitalism that we practice is sustainable. Ultimately, it will prove itself not to be, I'm sure.
How does that affect the interconnect? There have been so many attempts at diversifying our communities and becoming more interconnected, but they seem to be pulling apart again. How much of that, how much of that is exacerbated by what we have going on right now in the
Well,
science and
let's
technology?
let's go back. Let's go back in time a little bit. Up until the 1980s, if you looked at the growth in the what used to be called the GDP, the gross domestic product, and you looked at the average wages of the middle class, those two things were rather tightly coupled.
Mhm.
It became decoupled in the 80s, and I remember watching it, and partly it was about a man named Jack Welch, who you probably have never heard of. Oh, you remember Jack Welch?
I know, I've heard of Jack Welch, yeah.
And the lionizing that was sort of in our media about this CEO who was suddenly doing all of these things and becoming wealthy.
Mhm.
And, then there's Nike, which again, people don't really seem to know the story of Nike, but Nike starts off with a thesis, I think it was at the Harvard Business School, about a model for how one could produce products in other countries, sell them here, and as a business reap enormous profits. And
Hmm.
so these things have, like I said, these things have been going on for a while, and there's been no pushback until now. Because, for example, the unfortunate murder of that United Health CEO is an example. The anger, there's an anger in our society now. And in my case, I believe it's quite justified, quite frankly, because if you go back to the housing crisis, millions of Americans lost enormous amounts of wealth when they lost their homes. And nobody has fixed that. And so until these kinds of problems are solved, I don't believe our society will be hospitable to fostering a widespread use of imagination that is not coupled to making lots of money.
Hmm.
And you can make lots of money, but you're not going to be able to create a citizenry that has the ability to innovate. And that's been the secret for our economy since at least World War II. Actually, longer than that, going
I
back.
think it's interesting. Your kids are went on to get PhDs as well.
Well, my daughter has hers, and my son's about a year away from his.
And your daughter is studying physics, isn't she?
She is at the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, and she studies electromagnetic signatures from spinning black holes, something her dad knows nothing about.
I mean, that's incredible. That's absolutely incredible. But she did that. She had benefits that you didn't. So you both have, I mean, didn't she, in a way, benefits that you didn't have?
Well, a moment ago, I paid tribute to my parents, my mother and my father, because both of them were. I mean, my sister and I talk about this all the time. We do not understand how our parents came into being. My mother was a typical 1950s mother. She didn't even know how to drive a car, but she painted, she did macrame, she sewed, uh, she fired clay figurines.
Oh, wow.
These are all things that people with imagination do, right? There's a creativity that's evidenced by that. And my dad, on the other hand, like I said, he never finished high school, but went on to become one of the first, among the first, among the first 50 African Americans to become a sergeant major in the U.S. Army, which is the highest enlisted rank that there is. My father was actually incredible, and I mean, he recognized that his 4-year-old son saying he wanted to be a scientist was a thing of value, so that when his 8-year-old version of his son was having trouble in school, he knew that the way that you unlock that is to go back to what that 4-year-old said to him. I mean, how many parents actually have that kind of awareness of their children? Um, my dad always encouraged me in academics. I mean, a lot of dads say, "Oh, get out there on the football field, the baseball field." No, no, my dad understood that this kid loves math. Let's let him grow to whatever extent that takes him and support him in that. Um, and then the final thing I guess I can say about dad is there used to be, and there may still be, a television show called C-SPAN with Brian Lamb. Uh,
Hmm.
And Brian interviewed me, I think it was around 2012 or so. And a couple of weeks after the interview, I got an email message from a gentleman. In fact, I still have the email message I was looking at the other day. And the email basically said, I saw you with Brian, great interview. I noticed your name was Sylvester Gates. Are you the son of Sylvester Gates, who was a soldier at Fort Bliss uh, in the early 60s? And I wrote back, yes. And his comment was that my father was the finest leader of men he had seen in 30 years of his military career. Now, where does that, I don't understand. Like I said, my sister and I don't understand where all of this came from in our parents. And so what my wife, who's a medical doctor, and I have done for our kids, I guess it's kind of similar. But in our case, you can understand where it came from. At least I can understand. Like I said, my father was born on a poor farm. He was a his father Joseph was a sugarcane farmer in Alabama. The closest city was Minden or Linden, and it was a typical story in the with KKK racism and terrorism. All that stuff went on. And so my father comes out of that, and at 12 years old, tells his father, who owns some land, I'm not going to be here for you to pass land on. I'm going to build a life for myself. My father actually did that. And so where does that come from? I don't have an explanation for that.
Then your next question, I don't know if you can be able to answer this, but like, how do you foster that creativity, that imagination,
Well, I could
those leadership?
that I have an answer for me.
Okay, good.
My wife and I very intentionally raised our kids. So a couple of things. So my children were born in 1993. And so back through the early 2000s, we had an enormous VHS collection of videotapes in the home because we use it to block what we were seeing on TV. So the first thing is that we made some decisions to isolate our children from the media and what we saw there that didn't support our values. That's one thing that we did. The other thing that we did is not overprogram the children. A lot of parents say you got to do this, you got to get ballet lessons, you got to do tennis lessons, you got to have poetry lessons. All this other stuff. We didn't do any of that. My theory, my wife's theory is that children are like flowers. You give them a sufficient amount of sunlight and water, but you let them grow. And that's what we did for our kids. The only requirements we had for our kids was you must do well in school. And the other thing is that we bought their first computers when they were 2 years old. So that by the time they began school, they already knew how to key punch and they knew how to read and write and all that stuff. And the other thing that we did was we celebrated mathematical acuity. My son spontaneously began adding when he was 2 years old. When that happened, we had a party. He worked his way through all of the three of the four basic arithmetic operations, so addition, subtraction, multiplication. He figured it all out in games and playing. Every time he did it, we had a party. My daughter was the one who figured out how to divide, and we had a party. So we celebrated intellectual achievement within our family. And then the other thing is that the kids grew up around me and my postdocs and my graduate students who often were over at our house. And so my son was probably 4 years old. And one day I came home from work and the door to his room was closed and the lights was off and I could hear laughing. I thought mischief must be afoot.
Mm-hmm.
So I go to the door, what's happening in here? And I see the room is dark and there's a flashlight and there's mirrors. And my son explains that they're doing an experiment, which is they are taking a flashlight and they're placing the mirrors on opposite walls on the opposite side of the room. And they're trying to see if they can get the light rays to bounce from one mirror to another. At which point I put my tail between my legs and said, have fun. So these are the kinds of things that led to our children.
And those are the kinds of things that can work for our parents with their children too. But that does require a little bit of unplugging.
It requires a lot of unplugging, not just a little. Remember, I mentioned that there are, in my opinion, there are negative trends at work in the society that ultimately will be extraordinarily costly. And one has to have some confidence in oneself so that you can identify what these are and provide a cocoon that will let your children come to blossom with whatever's inside of them.